Today there was very unexpected news. The United States canceled the Constellation-class frigate project. Except for the first 2 ships that have already started construction, the remaining 4 that hadn't started were all canceled. For the US Navy, during the Cold War, it always maintained a 3-tier ship system. At the peak of the Cold War in the 1980 seconds, the top tier of the US 3-tier ships was its Air Defense Command ship, the Ticonderoga class. In the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds, the greatest threat to the US Navy was Soviet nuclear submarines. So the US at that time introduced the 8,000-ton Spruance-class anti-submarine destroyer. As for the cannon fodder ships, those were the Perry class. It can be said that this 3-tier ship system was very healthy, especially the Ticonderoga and Spruance classes, which even used the same hull. After the mid-1980 seconds, with the enhancement of Soviet shore-based aviation and the Soviet Air Force's blue water strike capability, the US introduced the Burke class in the late 1980 seconds. The Burke class was actually designed by the US during the Cold War. By the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US was invincible. The Chinese Navy at that time could hardly pose a threat to the US Navy. Just after the Cold War ended, many American novelists wrote alternate history, feeling that Russia was no longer their opponent. At that time, they also envisioned the Japanese Navy as the US's main future adversary. Many novels in the 1990 seconds were about the Japanese Navy attacking the US Navy again, and then the US Navy jointly with the Chinese and Russian navies beating up the Japanese Navy. It was precisely because the US was invincible after the Cold War, and even Japan could not actually command US forces. The US used its political power and Japan obeyed submissively. In that situation, after the mid-1990 seconds, the US proposed the from the sea strategy. A key point in the from the sea strategy was that the US Navy basically pinned the opponent down and beat them at their doorstep. This included the US at the time creating expeditionary bases converted from cargo ships. The US would create these expeditionary bases, but actually these ships were very slow, and their survivability in wartime was not strong. The key was the US was dominant and wanted to block the opponent at their doorstep and beat them. It was precisely because of this tactical thinking that the US in the 1990 seconds designed the famous Zumwalt and LCS, 2 types of warships that are widely criticized today. The most prominent feature of the Zumwalt is its 2 155mm naval guns on the bow. The range of these guns is over 100 kilometers. This included the US idea at the time that by 2010, the Zumwalt would also be equipped with railguns. Actually, whether it's the 155mm gun or the railgun, their long-range strike capability is inferior to cruise missiles. The key reason the US developed the 155mm gun and railgun was that they thought using missiles was too wasteful. With their strength, they could directly position themselves about 100 kilometers off the opponent's coastline and carry out strikes. If the opponent's anti-ship capability improved, according to US thinking at the time, the best anti-ship missile China could field in the future would have an effective range of only about 300 kilometers, because anti-ship missiles need mid-course guidance beyond 40 kilometers. The US believed that with its naval and air strength, China would have no way to provide mid-course guidance for anti-ship missiles beyond 300 kilometers. Thus, the Zumwalt was created. As for the LCS, its development purpose was mainly minesweeping and striking various types of enemy fast attack craft. In the early 2000s, the most famous fast attack craft in our country was the Type 22 missile boat, which was very fast. To combat various fast attack craft, the LCS's armament is very weak. It mainly relies on a 57mm rapid-fire gun on the bow, with a rate of fire of 220 rounds per minute, which is quite suitable for attacking fast attack craft. Moreover, LCS ships are very fast, exceeding 40 knots. Their power is on the same level as the Burke class. Including the F-35 aircraft developed by the US at the time, it was also based on the from the sea strategic concept. So the US concept at the time was, Burke class provides air defense cover for the carrier, Zumwalt conducts land attack strikes against the opponent, and LCS drives away the harassing fast attack craft. But after 2010, with the commissioning of our country's DF-21D and DF-26 ballistic anti-ship missiles, And after 2016, the launch of our country's Type 52D-like dumplings, including the Type 54A, and after 2018, the appearance of the Type 055, the US Zumwalt and LCS became very impractical. So the LCS, which hasn't been in service for long, is facing retirement, because its hull structure allocates a lot to the power system. Its power is on the same level as the Burke class, but its armament is very sparse. Although the LCS has strong surface mobility and high speed, your warship is fast, but not faster than enemy aircraft. The LCS carrying long-range cruise missiles is very disproportionate to its hull size and the number it can carry, so the LCS is definitely going to be phased out. As for the Zumwalt, it can still be used as a last resort. After all, the hull is large enough. The US plans to remove one of its 155mm guns in the future and install the latest US Dark Eagle intermediate-range ballistic missile. As for the railgun, the US has now abandoned its development. Although we saw the US developing railguns, and we also developed corresponding railguns placed on our landing ships, actually, 4 railguns, although their range is greatly increased compared to traditional naval guns, the accuracy and range of railguns are still far inferior to anti-ship missiles. So regarding the railgun, the US abandoned its development, and we were only doing technical tracking at the time. Our Navy's design philosophy is still future fleet decisive battle. In fleet decisive battles, railguns are not very practical, so the development progress of our country's railgun has also slowed down. At that time, the US conceived a return to blue water strategy, returning to its Cold War thinking. The 10,000-ton destroyer designed by the US at the time was the DDG, because for the US, the greatest threat from the Chinese military is still its air power. As for underwater power, compared to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the gap is still quite large. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had over 300 submarines, including over 100 nuclear submarines and over 100 conventional submarines. Our country now has less than 100 submarines combined, including conventional submarines, nuclear submarines, and ballistic missile submarines. What the US is more concerned about is China's rapidly growing air force. The US 3-tier ships all emphasize air defense capability, and they also use a common radar, the SPY-6 radar. The SPY-6 radar is a digital active electronically scanned array, AESA. It can achieve different capabilities through different combinations of subarrays. The Constellation class also uses the SPY-6 radar with only 9 modules. However, because it is a new digital AESA radar, the Constellation class radar's frontal area is much smaller than the SP-1, but its detection accuracy and range are the same as the SP-1. So in the US 3-tier ship concept, the Constellation class's air detection capability is not inferior to the Burke class. Of course, its VLSLs are reduced, which is also related to it mainly undertaking secondary tasks, not primary tasks. And at that time, the US also, because of the unreliability of the previous Zumwalt and LCS, in its return to blue water strategy, the DDG DAX was to be completely redesigned from scratch. In the US military, it's normal for such a project's progress to be slightly delayed. The Constellation class was needed because after the Cold War, the US retired all of its Perry-class frigates. The miscellaneous tasks were all handed over to the Burke class, so the Burke class's tasks became very heavy. So we often saw the Burke class, before the exposure of the US's completely hollowed out defense industrial capacity, the Burke class was already rusty. The key reasons, besides the decline in US industrial capability, are also greatly related to the Burke class's long-term inability to return to home port for corresponding maintenance. So when designing the Constellation class, the requirement was to use a mature design. The bids for the Constellation class were also mature designs. The US at that time chose the Italian Frem, a frigate already in extensive service with the Italian and French navies, as the base design for redesign. The US required that the design changes to the hull of the Constellation class compared to the Italian Frem should not exceed 15%, but the US probably thought, Italy, what's your status? To use the same grade of warship as me. Even my 3rd-tier ship must be stronger than your 1st-tier ship. So during the construction of the Constellation class, the design was constantly changed. This eventually resulted in the design changes of the Constellation class compared to the Italian Frem exceeding 85%. A ship with over 85% design changes is basically a completely newly designed warship. Additionally, the shipyard chosen to build the Constellation class is Fincantieri, a subsidiary in the US. The location of this Fincantieri shipyard itself is not ideal. It's in an inland lake area in the mid-northern US. The conditions of that shipyard itself are not ideal. When it won the bid for the Constellation-class project, the Fincantieri shipyard at the time did not even have the capability to build it. It had to make additional investments and expand the shipyard's infrastructure to gain the capability to build the Constellation-class. Plus, due to the pandemic and the overall industrial hollowing out of the US, we see that the Constellation-class, which started construction in 2020, has only reached 12% completion today. That's a bit outrageous. Even the worst, India, when building the Kolkata-class with roughly similar displacement, building a Kolkata-class in 5 years. At least the hull is visible. But today's Constellation-class doesn't even have a visible hull, which is very outrageous. After 2020, the Chinese Navy not only commissioned the Type 055, but the biggest characteristic is the large-scale commissioning of various types of UAVs in our country, and the geometric increase in the number of our ballistic missiles. Besides ballistic missiles, there are also various cruise missiles. In this situation, the US believes its first island chain is no longer safe. In this situation, after 2020, the US proposed the concept of distributed lethality. A famous example in the Air Force is Rapid Raptor, using one C-17 and one KC-135 to support 3 to 4 F-22 seconds, making short stays at forward airfields, hitting fast and leaving quickly. The tactic is somewhat similar to what our country conceived in the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds for the J-12, which is air guerrilla warfare. The US Army also developed HIMARS. The rockets and ballistic missiles launched by HIMARS are actually the same as those used by the US Cold War-era M270 MLRS. The key reason for developing HIMARS is that the M270 cannot be transported by C-130. The C-130 has relatively strong rough field takeoff and landing capability. HIMARS weighs only half of the M270's weight. Of course, its ammunition load is also only half of the M270's. For example, the M270 can carry 12 227mm rockets and 2 short-range ballistic missiles. HIMARS can only carry 1 ballistic missile and 6 227mm rockets. But it is relatively light. HIMARS weighs about 16 tons, so it can be carried inside a C-130 and moved around. In recent years, the US has also developed anti-ship missiles carried by Cone 132nds, or on landing craft unmanned vehicles, to fight island guerrilla warfare, in an attempt to disperse the strike capability of the Chinese military through more bases. Of course, this design concept might be acceptable for its anti-ship missiles or HIMARS, but for the Air Force it's actually very problematic, because for air combat, if you only talk about quality and not quantity, it's just dishonest. The conditions at many of these forward operating airfields used by the US are very poor. Although supplies for F-22 seconds or F-35 seconds can be airlifted using C-17 transport aircraft, a conventional US military base deploying a wing of 24 F-22 seconds, a random number, might require 200 maintenance personnel, but maintaining 4 F-22 seconds does not require only 1/6 of the ground crew. The required ground crew could be 1/3 or even 1/2. In this situation, after the Obama administration took office, due to its education reforms, the US military is basically based on a happy education system. And to be honest, it's almost like being illiterate. In this case, the number of ground crew needs to be greatly increased, and the number of US troops itself also needs to increase. So the actual combat effectiveness of the US Air Force's so-called distributed strike is very doubtful. The US Navy now also envisions distributed strike. They think that since their naval ships are in such danger between the first and second island chains, rather than that, they might as well just use unmanned vessels entirely. They rely on their air-based network and their relatively strong air force. Especially the US has many relay communication aircraft. In this situation, they would fight a maritime guerrilla war using unmanned vessels to attrit the Chinese Navy. Of course, the protection of US aircraft carriers still requires proper destroyers. They cannot rely on unmanned vessels to protect conventional carriers. Currently, the US envisions using its unmanned vessels to replace the role of the Constellation-class in the future, performing miscellaneous tasks on the front lines, including minesweeping, anti-submarine warfare, and attrition warfare. This is the US military's concept, including the US Congress proposing to use smaller warships, namely unmanned vessels of about 500 to 1,000 tons, to replace the role of the Constellation-class. Of course, the US concept is ambitious, but the reality is harsh. This recent military parade on September 3rd basically shattered this US concept. At the September 3rd parade, we saw a large exposure of our country's various UAVs, unmanned vessels, and underwater gliders. Many weapons are already in service, forming a sharp contrast with the US, which is still testing. Our unmanned vessels actually started being used very early. Our country's unmanned vessels were initially used for maritime obstacle clearance and mine sweeping in the Taiwan Strait, and have been in use for a long time. Today, our unmanned vessels have already gone through many iterations. If the US compares itself to China in other areas, it's hard to say, but if it compares itself to China in terms of UAV production and unmanned vessels, the US is actually overthinking it. The competition in unmanned vessels and UAVs essentially comes down to a battle of attrition. The US is on the first island chain, but its industry actually very much does not support this strategy. If the battlefield is moved to the second island chain, although the US is now restarting some facilities on the second island chain, however, we can see that the distances between the islands of the second island chain, as well as the number of islands, are far less than those of the first island chain. And now, rebuilding the second island chain, besides doubts about the US's infrastructure capability, is actually also very costly. So for the US to try to engage in those various impractical ideas on the second island chain is actually quite useless. The US should truly face its real problems. Its real problem is that its shipbuilding industry is no longer capable. It should make US industry no longer hollowed out and improve its industrial capability to ultimately confront China. In the end, it essentially comes down to a competition of quantity, which fundamentally means a contest of industrial capacity. So I think the US will eventually have to backtrack and probably will have to resume building a new generation of frigates. If it now relies entirely on the Burke class, or if the US's future warships are reduced to only two tiers, only the DDGX and the Burke class, having the Burke class perform many tasks is itself an overuse of its capabilities, especially for secondary tasks like anti-submarine warfare and escort duties. Using the Burke class for these is a bit of an overkill, given that the US is deindustrialized. In this situation, our country's third-tier ships like the Type 054, including the next-generation frigate after the 054, their capability doesn't need to be stronger than the Burke class. Including the ship's propulsion and radar electronic equipment, the specifications can be lowered. In this case, its production rate and the number of shipyards suitable for building it will be greater, and thus the quantity produced can be much larger, because naval warfare, in the end, is also about attrition. So if the US lacks a third-tier ship, fighting a naval battle between the first and second island chains in the future would actually be very problematic. Relying on those impractical unmanned vessels is not very meaningful. And there's another problem. Because there are no people on board, damage control becomes a major issue. Like many manned warships, if they are hit by an anti-ship missile, or a bomb, or even a torpedo, if the damage control personnel on the ship are well trained, they can often save ships that are considered certain to sink, bringing them back from the brink. But on unmanned vessels, there are no people. If it sustains battle damage, restoring its navigation capability, or promptly extinguishing a fire would be very problematic. So unmanned vessels are not suitable to be made too large. If a warship is made too small, aside from the reduced number of weapons it can carry, the grade of its sensors alone is much worse. Like this US unmanned vessel, its tonnage has reached nearly 1,000 tons, which is not much smaller than our country's Type 056. Then we can see that it cannot carry very good sensors. Apart from cost constraints, a key reason is also that the ship is too small. Compared to the Type 056, if the 056 is hit by an anti-ship missile, as long as it's not a vital hit, the crew's damage control capability might still save the ship. But for these US unmanned vessels of over 1,000 tons, if the ship is damaged and not repaired promptly, not only will it lose combat capability, but the ship might directly sink. Looking at it now, although the US has abandoned the Constellation-class project, if the US Navy can wake up in time, it's not hopeless. After all, among its allies, there are actually 3 types of warships that are quite suitable to serve as the US's future third-tier ship. The problem with modifying the FREM into the Constellation class was that the superstructure changes were very significant. Because the FREM originally used a rotating radar, compared to the FREM, the Constellation class uses fixed radar arrays. Therefore, the changes to the superstructure relative to the Italian FREM were substantial. But now among US allies, like Spain's F-110 frigate or Spain's original F-100 frigate, both have a very large radar apparatus mounted on top of the bridge, including the Spanish F-100, which was also sold to Australia as the Hobart class. If they were to replace the radar with the future US SPY-6, the radar used on the Constellation-class, the difficulty wouldn't be too great, and the ship modifications wouldn't need to be too extensive, including Japan's Mogami-class, which also has 4 C-band radar faces. In the future, if they want to replace this radar with the SPY-6 V3 version radar from the Constellation-class, I personally estimate the problem wouldn't be too big either. If the US still thinks Spain's F-110, or Spain's F-100, or Japan's Mogami are too expensive, there is actually another choice. That is the frigate designed by France, the FDI. The displacement of the FDI frigate is only 4,500 tons, similar to our country's Type 54A. It also has 4 array faces on top. Although its radar arrays are smaller, I personally believe that if the US really chooses the French FDI as its third-tier ship, they should not make too many changes. They should not further increase the size of the radar arrays. After all, the SPY-6 is a digital AESA. At worst, they can reduce the number of modules per face, which would just mean a performance reduction. For secondary anti-submarine and secondary air defense roles, I personally think that would be sufficient. It remains to be seen when the US will wake up to this. If the US later truly intends to use 500 to 1,000 ton unmanned vessels as its third-tier ships, I believe the US Navy of the future will not be on the same level as the Chinese Navy. The US Navy will basically be saying goodbye to being a world-class top navy.